I wanted to do something different today. I wanted to break down the movie It Ends With Us through the lens of the unconscious patterns that get developed in childhood and suck us into toxic, unhealthy relationships and keep us there. Now, I know there's a lot in the news about what's going on with this movie, the after effects and everything, but I kind of want to put that aside because the actual story of It Ends With Us, I feel like deserves so much more attention than it's getting. So let's take a look at what we can learn from this story so that we can break our unconscious patterns. And so I'm going to go over 7 different unconscious patterns that we need to be aware of if we had any type of trauma in childhood. Now, it's not an all-inclusive list, so if I miss anything, make sure you comment about it in the comment section below. So let's dive in. For those that don't know me, my name is Michele. I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner, which means that I help people through unhealed past trauma by working directly with their nervous system. And I'm also the founder of the School of Transformation, which is where we combine mind and body somatic practices to heal in a group setting. So if either of those resources sound like they would be helpful for you, make sure you check out the links above. So the first unconscious pattern I want to bring out is when you're taught unconsciously to hide or stifle abuse. So Lily Bloom, the main character who gets sucked into a toxic relationship, had an abusive family system in her childhood. No surprise there. Unfortunately, if you had an abusive family system, it's more likely that you get sucked into one because of the unconscious patterns that are formed when you're in childhood. So let's dive into that first one. And we actually see it as a result of the abused mom, right? Sometimes we look at the abuser and we understand the patterns that they create. They're kind of obvious patterns. We fail to notice how sometimes the adult parent that's getting abused can even accidentally form unconscious patterns in their children as well. And we see this in the beginning, and it has to do with what's happening at the funeral. The mom is wanting Lily to go up and present 5 things that she loves about her father. And it's obvious that Lily does not want to do this and probably can't even think of 5 things she loves about this person that has created so much trauma in her life, right? But she gets up there, she goes, and during the eulogy, she has her notes, which are blank, no surprise. But she looks over at her mom, and the mom's like, go ahead, kind of like telling her, perform, make everyone feel comfortable. Don't say anything that would be uncomfortable. Just do this because it's what is expected at a funeral. Forget about the truth. Let's just focus on this. Now, when a child grows up and sees abuse being minimized, slipped under the rug, and then the child is taught to just don't say anything that would make anyone uncomfortable. Let's just pretend everything is fine and beautiful. That creates an unconscious pattern that can cause that child in that circumstances to grow up and not be able to spot red flags. It's almost like the red flag alarm is so dulled, it doesn't go off when it should. Recently, I used an illustration about a moth, right? The moth goes near the fire because it's cold, it wants to get warm, but because the alarm for danger doesn't go off, it gets so close to the fire, it gets burned. That's what happens in people that are trained to not look at those red flags, to minimize them, to focus on the good. Their red flag alarm doesn't go off and they get sucked into toxic, unhealthy relationships in their adult life, which is what happened with Lily. Now, in her defense, she doesn't perform. She doesn't slip into that fawn trauma response, which is what her mom kind of taught her accidentally. And I say this with all respect because when you're in that abusive relationship, you're trying to survive and navigate it. You don't even realize that this is what you're promoting in your children is that fawn trauma response. But the good news is that she doesn't do that. She doesn't give the eulogy. She apologizes and she leaves. Now, that's putting a stop to a pattern, but that's not necessarily healing it. She stopped falling into that fawn trauma response, but because the subconscious or the unconscious patterns that drive it were not addressed, that's why she was able to get sucked back into another unhealthy relationship with Ryle. And so just speaking from my own personal experience, I had a very unhealthy family system when I was growing up, and I ran away from home at 16. It was the best thing I ever did because I got myself out of that toxic environment, and I found a wonderful family that were absolutely beautiful, completely changed the trajectory of my life. However, I realize now that my trauma from childhood wasn't healed because I left. It simply went dormant. And when the right circumstances came along to have that come up again, that's what happened. So I really want to stress the difference between leaving and putting an end to a toxic relationship or an unhealthy pattern and healing it. Okay, but let's get back to Lily and let's fast forward to that scene where she's on the rooftop and here's Ryle completely emotionally dysregulated and showing aggression and violence. And then you look at her and how she responds to that. And she doesn't bat an eye. She doesn't jump. She's completely calm, watching and observing this display of aggression and dysregulation. And so I really want to highlight that depending on your nervous system, some people might react very jumpy. The second he kicked that chair, they might have jumped. They might have been alert. Oftentimes when that happens, when you're extremely jumpy after childhood trauma, it's because your nervous system is stuck orienting to danger. It doesn't stop looking for it. And so it hears it in every sound, every expression, every person. Once it detects danger, then the next thing it would do is put you in either fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. You wouldn't choose your behavior. Your nervous system would choose it for you. However, in her case, she's not at that heightened state like that at that moment. To me, it could be that her nervous system is already stuck in a trauma response. It's not looking for danger to go there. It's already there. And to me, it looks like the freeze response. So it might be that in childhood, all that violence and danger and fear had her in her freeze response, and she's never fully left it. So that's just an observation, a possibility. I'd be curious about your observations as well. But you notice that she's just looking at it like nothing happened. And so here's an unconscious pattern that we have to realize, that when somebody acts like that in a way that's extremely familiar to how we were in childhood, and if we have not healed from that past trauma, our nervous system will be like, this looks like that. And instead of having you handle it from the adult you are today, it will choose the trauma response that you were in when those behaviors were first introduced to you. So if in childhood, her seeing her dad hitting her mom and all that violence that she experienced had her in a freeze response, then when she sees it as an adult, instead of responding and saying, that's a red flag, I'm out of here, a person's nervous system will put you in that freeze response. So the next unconscious pattern I want to highlight that took place on that rooftop between Lily and Ryle is her oversharing. Oversharing is a trauma response, and it's actually a sign of underlying compartmentalization. And the roots of this compartmentalization stem from two things. One is emotional disconnection. Rather than processing what happened in the past, it's like you're declaring it outward, and it can almost sound like you're telling a story, right? Even when she shares about her first sexual experience, it's almost like she's just telling this story, and that was such a traumatizing event, but you don't notice that. She's just like sharing that with a stranger that she met 2 minutes ago that was completely emotionally dysregulated and is now crossing her boundaries. But hey, I'm going to share my deepest wounds with you. And that it also stems from avoiding any introspection. So instead of processing on a deeper level what happened to you, the focus is external. It's also part of a flight trauma response. I have been so guilty of oversharing as part of a flight trauma response. It's almost like we're trying to outrun our feelings or outrun what happened to us by talking and sharing so much. I've done that and afterwards left a conversation and been like, what just happened? Why did I just tell that person all of that? Why couldn't I stop that? So let's talk about how this is a flight response. And this is really giving us clues to really watch what our nervous system does. Our nervous system, like a manual car, doesn't stay in one gear. It's like shifting gears all the time. And the gears that it shifts are our fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, right? So she was in some freeze, and now we see her going into some flight. So again, let's break down why that's a flight trauma response. So one of the reasons it's part of the flight trauma response is because oversharing, especially to strangers, people you don't know, is a way of escaping emotional intensity. And the reason is because we tend to repress, ignore, suppress what happened to us. We shove it in a compartmentalized door somewhere in our subconscious mind. We don't handle it, but it's getting more and more full, right? And then we get nervous, something happens, and we open that door, and boom, we vomit it all out of us. We have not processed any of that. We've just flung it out of us. And so what we've really done is shifted from inner reflection to external expression with no processing. Another reason we shift into the flight response sometimes is when we're seeking safety through connection. And this is kind of what I feel like was happening with Lily. Oversharing can be an unconscious attempt to create a bond or to receive validation or reassurance, especially if you're feeling unsafe or disconnected internally. And I feel like that's what was happening again with Lily. And so here's another teaching point, honestly, because if we lived in an environment when we were children that was not safe, we never learned how to embody safety on the inside. Now, remember, when we're small, we cannot create that safety from within. We need our surroundings to help us to know what safety is so that then we can understand it and then recreate it as an adult. But when we don't have that, we get stuck in fawn or flight. And what our nervous system is doing is it's seeking safety outside of self. So if we don't learn how to uproot that unconscious pattern of not being able to feel safe or of seeking it outside of self in relationships, then we can leave people that the pattern will just show up in a different way in our life. Now, there's a lot more that I can say that happened on that rooftop, but let's fast forward to he's starting to win her over, right? And they're at this party and she's like, you just have to stop. You have to stop doing this. You have to stop looking at me like this. You have to stop following me. And then he completely cuts her off and he's like, will you just shut up for a minute? And her response, okay. And again, looking at it through the lens of possible unconscious patterns, we see through her response that there's no red flag going off in her head. And it's like she's almost going to like a child agreeability. And it happened like that. To me, it's almost like she went into like a mini emotional flashback. Maybe not consciously, but her nervous system may have noticed that way of being talked to from childhood. That aggression, that you need to do this, what I say, even if it's coming across rude and disrespectful, and an automatic need to appease. That's what that looked like at that moment. She didn't notice the red flag. Now we see a shift into the fawn response. Stifle all those boundaries that you were trying to set and show up in a way that makes him happy so that you can then feel safe. And again, I get it. Like when you're in it and your nervous system is choosing these responses, it's turning off your prefrontal cortex, your logic, and it's going back to these old, young, learned behaviors from childhood. And I know in my life, I remember, like I can watch this movie and be like, oh, I see that. Like, how could she let him talk to her like that? But I remember one relationship that I was in. I was out with friends with this person, and my girlfriend tells me, she's like, it doesn't make you uncomfortable how he talks to you? And I literally, this is kind of embarrassing, but I literally looked at her and was confused. Like, what do you mean how he's talking to me? I didn't know, like Lily, that I was in a fawn trauma response and that aggressive behavior was actually kicking on in my life. Okay, let's fast forward to when Lily wants to go out to eat with her mom, right? And she's telling Ryle, and she didn't invite him, and he's really upset about that. And she's trying to put down this boundary. Like, it seems almost silly that she has to. And you can sense that she's like, what's the big deal? Like, it's just me and my mom. And at that moment, he picks that moment when she's wanting to, again, establish some kind of boundary to tell her, I love you. And you almost notice how all of her thoughts of like, why do you want to be with me and my mom? Like, let's just, this is ridiculous. I just want to be with my mom. That like goes away like that. And her brain forms like cognitive bias now because it becomes so focused on those words. He loves me. This man that's never let anyone love him, that has never been a relationship and love guy, the unconquerable guy loves me. And it swipes everything that was in her mind prior. So, unconscious patterns. When we're living a traumatic childhood where there's a lot of highs and lows, where love and pain are kind of inseparable, the brain does something to help us to tolerate that. And it like deletes the bad and has us hyper focus on the positive. I've seen this in a lot of the clients or members that come in the School of Transformation. I've had members come in and tell me, Michele, I had a great childhood. I had a wonderful, amazing childhood. I love my parents. I have a wonderful relationship with them, but I'm in this adult relationship that's really, really toxic. So it's not childhood trauma. It's just this adult relationship that I'm in. And then by the time they leave the School of Transformation, because we do so much focus on the inner healing work of these unconscious patterns, by the time they leave the School of Transformation, they come to realize that their brain deleted the truth, deleted what was painful, and had them hyper-focused as a protection. And healing, it's uncomfortable, but it's about coming face to face with the truths and the patterns that were formed because of those truths, and then rewiring them so that they're more in harmony with who we really are instead of who the trauma turned us into, right? But here, again, as a result of that pattern in childhood, we notice that something positive comes in, and any doubts that may have begun starting to form in her, any signs that she starts to notice, like, why are you getting so upset about this? They go out the window the second one positive comes along. And again, that is something that happens a lot if you had a traumatic childhood that is still unhealed. Again, I know with myself, there was a relationship that I was in, and I was starting to notice, like, this is not good for me. This is not, I'm not happy. I'm crying when I should be laughing and enjoying this relationship. And I made this decision that I was going to end the relationship. And it's almost like that person detected that I was starting to get to that one foot out the door place. And that person did the exact same thing as Ryle. Poured out all these feelings that he hadn't expressed before, which was why I was ending the relationship. I was like, this doesn't make sense. We're together. Like, if I ask you what you like about me, you can't even answer it. Like, it's weird. Like, why are we together? And so I was at that point of leaving, and that's when all this expression of feelings came out. And sadly, just like Lily, it was as if all that doubt got wiped because it was a familiar pattern. Anytime I would start to notice the bad and it would be too painful, in childhood, my brain would delete it and focus on this one itty bitty crumb that was happening in life. So it happens. If it's familiar and you've noticed that too, like, let me know in the comment section below, because I think that's one of the reasons why Justin Baldoni wanted to make this movie, so that people can see what really happens, not to feel judgment, but to understand it and support each other and to start breaking patterns. So if this is familiar to you as much as it was with me as well, share in the comment section below and let's be a support for each other. But getting back to Lily, once that confirmation bias is formed, he loves me, then the brain works hard to point out all the things that give evidence that support it and ignore anything that doesn't support it. So rather than noticing as time is going on, more and more red flags are showing up, it's almost like it's just getting shoved under the rug. It's just not being addressed because he loves her. And so that confirmation bias, if you're in a toxic relationship, can lead your brain to getting stuck in deep, severe cognitive dissonance, where your brain cannot wrap itself around two opposing ideas. And the movie visually demonstrated this so well when, right, there's this confirmation bias that he loves me, but then there's this action when the frittata is burning where he overreacts and gets violent and hits her. Then there's the other occurrence where he's so angry at her and she's trying to calm him down. She's in that fawn trauma response again of trying to appease him and calm him down, that he pushes her down the stairs, and she's struggling at first to wrap her mind around these two things, and she's making excuses and she's not even seeing it visually. And I really loved how the movie at the end, it was like how it portrayed it looking accidental in the end when her brain blew past that cognitive dissonance and she could see and grasped onto reality when it got to see that maybe he says he loves me and this is abuse and this is wrong. And she was able to grasp both of those. And then once she's out of that cognitive dissonance, she does make the decision to leave, which honestly, considering her past trauma and how it's still so unhealed, the fact that she did that, like, amazing. His reaction, a little unrealistic. Oh, okay, bye. Like, that's doesn't usually tend to happen. However, what I do want to highlight about the end and the fact that she left is, once again, just like when she walked off that podium and did not give the eulogy, she was putting an end, or is, I should say in the movie, putting an end to the abuse that Ryle was inflicting on her. But this is a choice point again. If she just leaves and, you know, in the end it shows, I guess she's going back to her first love, who seems to be a healthy relationship, which is wonderful, great. The reality though is that one of two things tends to happen if we don't do the inner work to heal these unconscious patterns that are so entrenched in our nervous system, and they'd override our logic and our conscious thinking. We will either, one, gravitate to another unhealthy relationship, and sometimes even worse, we can go from an overt abuser to a covert abuser to a psychopath, right? That's one of the possibilities. However, and this is a truth that I think is a little bit hard to swallow, but sometimes the patterns that we have in us can cause us to show up with our children in such a way that creates an unhealthy dynamic between us and our children, where we show up in those unhealed wounds like, I'm unworthy, I'm less than, I don't deserve, boundaries are bad, my job is to make you happy. If you're upset or disappointed or angry with me, it's my fault and I have to do things to regulate you. All those unconscious wounds, if we show up like that with our children, we can accidentally train them to be in a toxic relationship with us where they are disrespectful, where they don't respect boundaries, where it's not reciprocal. So the stakes are high when it comes to unhealed trauma. If it doesn't affect our romantic relationships, it can affect our relationships with our children. So bottom line, if this movie resonated with you and you can notice unhealed patterns in yourself, it's wonderful when we put an end to abuse. But then we want to take the next step and uproot the unconscious patterns that are in our nervous system, because those patterns are like, think of yourself holding down a beach ball or beach balls in water, right? And you're holding them down, you're trying to keep them underwater. Eventually, they come flying up. It's the same thing with unhealed or repressed trauma. Eventually, circumstance opens the door to them once again. So we really need to take the time to do that inner work. And if you're looking for a resource to help you, come join me in the School of Transformation, because that's what we do. Yes, we learn about what abusers have done in our life, but our focus is on the unconscious patterns that are still there so that we can break free of them and stop repeating them in our life. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, make sure you join me live weekly on Zoom in the School of Transformation.